Hi, everyone, and welcome to the panel. Today, we'll be discussing how the psychedelics industry can pursue the research and development needed to bring psychedelic treatments to market. As implied by the title of this panel, there's a strong financial component to making sure that this happens, and we have some speakers here with us who will be able to speak to this point, both from a company's perspective as well as from the perspective of a securities exchange. Now, I'm going to go ahead and give a short intro to all our panelists. We have here with us today Richard Carleton, CEO of the Canadian Securities Exchange, Greg McKee, Chairman and CEO of Tryp Therapeutics, and Dr. Roger McIntyre, CEO and Director of Braxia Scientific, formerly known as Champion Brands. Now, I'm going to let each of our speakers give a short intro of themselves before we get going. If you guys could just give a short 1 to 2 minute backgrounder of yourself, that'd be great. Richard, why don't you start us off?
Thank you very much, Yeji, and it's a delight and a pleasure to be sharing the stage with Greg and Roger today. Again, as you said, I'm the CEO of the Canadian Securities Exchange, and I'm approaching my 10th anniversary in that role. Really, the Canadian Securities Exchange is known, I think, globally for our early support for the cannabis industry. Back in 2014, when the Canadian regime for legal recreational use of cannabis was forming. And then we've done some important work over the years with the US cannabis industry as well. And that's really provided us with a strong foundation to support the emergence and the rise of the psychedelics industry as well. There are a lot of commonalities in the finance for these industries. A lot of the same players are backing the research efforts and business development efforts. And we've become an important part of the financial life cycle for many of these entrepreneurs, not just from Canada and the United States, but on a global scale at this point.
Great, thank you. Roger, take it away.
Angie, thanks for that. And Richard, great to be with yourself, also yourself as well, Greg. And good day to everyone. Thanks for joining us. I am the CEO of Braxia Scientific Core. My background is almost 25 years now as a psychiatrist, but as really an academic researcher who's really straddled this intersection between research and development and business development, worked largely with large pharma in the last 25 years in drug discovery and drug development for depression and related disorders. My group, which is located in Toronto, but also has organizational activities in the United States, Asia, and Europe, has brought many antidepressants to market with large pharma in the last 25 years. And it's also been my sort of proud achievement that we brought to Canada the first ever psychedelic community-based program for people with depression. We offer ketamine for now. It's expanded to 4 clinics in Canada with a US focus going forward. And it's part not only of the vision to provide for people who need these innovative treatments, but also taking 20, 25 years of experience in this space to really develop these treatments for people who need them in a way that matters most to the FDA and other regulators, and also a way that's commercially very successful. Great to be with you all.
Thanks, Roger. Go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's great to be here. And on the panel, my name is Greg McKee. I'm Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Tryp Therapeutics. I'm very excited about the opportunity in front of us to help patients with great unmet medical need. I've been working in drug development now for about 25 years. I started my career with Genzyme Corporation out in Asia, in Southeast Asia, in China, Singapore, and also in Tokyo. I've lived in Asia for 9 years now. Most of my drug development expertise has been in relatively early stage drug development areas, post Genzyme, and our work on Gaucher's disease. I worked on 2 different major therapeutic approaches. One was a gene therapy company in the Bay Area. And then I was chief executive of an immunotherapy company working in oncology prior to coming to Tryp. I'm very excited about this arena for a number of different reasons. My first exposure to the psychedelic space was frankly down here in Southern California through a group of former Navy SEALs that I worked with on another investment project. And almost every single one of those individuals, it turned out, of course, had some form of depression or PTSD. And many of them had used some form of a psychedelic to treat their conditions. And they were all looking for better access. Post that experience, I met the founder of Tryp and joined the board in the early part of this year, and then stepped into the role as chief executive about 3 months ago. But find this to be a really interesting space and great opportunity and potential for patients with these unmet needs.
Thanks, Greg. Now, Richard touched on this a little bit, for those not quite familiar, a lot of psychedelics companies have gone public over the past year or so, mainly on Canadian exchanges like the CSE. And cannabis companies, they did the same thing, but they did it because of federal illegality issues. Psychedelics companies, they don't exactly fit that same box because what they're doing is legal. They're developing medications through the FDA pathway, among some other things. Now, a big problem a lot of these companies face is the sheer cost of developing these medications and putting them through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials. So I want to throw this first question over to you, Greg and Roger. You guys both are heading companies that are undergoing this process. It's really expensive. It's really time consuming. Can you tell us a little bit about what that's like? Greg, let's start with you.
Sure. Yeah, happy to kick that off, and really rich topic to cover. So as I'm sure Roger will also attest, drug development is, as you mentioned, a very expensive, very time consuming, process, and it's also highly detailed with hundreds and hundreds of decisions you need to make on every single, trial. The good news is that we're asking really complicated questions in very well controlled settings, typically. With a lot of thought that goes into the design of clinical studies. And at the end of those studies, we typically discover a number of different things about the safety and efficacy of the chemistries that we're testing. So I think overall, there's a lot of benefit from this research and this approach to really ask questions in a scientific manner, driven on the evidence that comes from that, and then that hopefully providing the safest, most efficacious compounds for patients and for physicians to use in the community. But it is a lengthy process with many different steps overall.
Can you touch a little bit on what it's like on the financial side of that? It obviously costs so much money to just go through the process. What are the challenges associated with that, Greg?
Sure. So it's an interesting dynamic, right? Because on the one hand, especially if you're public like we are, we're publicly listed on the CSE, thanks to Richard and his team there. And our investors, of course, are looking for hints in terms of our progress. They're looking for updates on a very frequent basis, right? They follow our news flow incredibly closely, which is fantastic. But the pace of their desire for news is challenging to keep up with, based on the pace of drug development, which is a much slower, process. There's many things are happening behind the scenes. So, for example, in some of the two-way studies that we're working right now, of course, as Roger will attest, besides the clinical trial protocol, all these protocols that we're working on have a psychotherapy component. So there's an entire protocol around the psychotherapy that's added to the therapeutic treatment. There's an investigator brochure, which is provided to those scientists and medical physicians who are actually running the clinical study. There is an informed consent, which is a very lengthy document that patients need to sign, and many other steps. And so all those different pieces take an incredible amount of time, and the pace of that work is quite fast behind the scenes, but the things that you can report on out to investors really are few and far between. So balancing those two, sort of the pace and the demand of having information on the one hand from investors versus the reality of what you can report that's really significant is a little bit of a juxtaposition of two different time frames that don't always necessarily fit together. So you're constantly juggling those two items, trying to raise cash at appropriate levels and evaluations to fund these expensive trials that typically will take a long time to generate significant and important news to share with investors.
Angie, let me pick up on that. This is such an important issue we're starting with. And I come at this, again, with a very long history of developing drugs in depression. It's really important for everybody to know that, everyone knows Prozac. We've had it for decades. Today, Prozac beats placebo in only about 50% of trials. And what that's telling us is something about how these drugs are being developed that needs to be as equally a focus as the drug itself. So there are three equal priorities. What is the drug we're developing? What is, in fact, the clinic, or what are the centers developing them? And then what are the right patients to be in these studies? And over the years, what's happened is that we've seen a tremendous, we've seen this patent cliff with many branded antidepressants, blockbuster antidepressants. Large pharma in the United States and Asia and Europe have really retreated away from psychiatry for two fundamental reasons. First is that the innovation just hasn't been there. Secondly, there has been a known unknown, not to get too much into Rumsfeld's language, but a known unknown. And the known unknowns are, we don't know what the right patients are for sure. There's in fact been too much intermediation. In other words, there's been too much bringing in other organizations to recruit patients into the studies that don't have the expertise there, and it hasn't been the innovative drug. What we have now is an incredible alignment of opportunity because we now have innovative medicines. Psychedelics are incredibly innovative. Ketamine started this going. Of course, others like psilocybin, others we're very excited about. Big pharma, who I work very closely with, is sitting on the sidelines when it comes to the more psychedelics, if you will, like the psilocybins and so on. They're obviously very much involved in ketamine derivatives. And they're sitting on the sidelines with respect to the psilocybin type molecules because, first of all, they know threat, they know opportunity better than anybody else, and they've been in this game a long, long time, and they have spent a lot of money in this area. And what they want to see is they want to see evidence of scientific efficacy and safety. They want to see organizations that have the track record of developing these specialty drugs. This isn't just, fast food drug development. And thirdly, do they have confidence in the data obtained in the patient study? In other words, this is a lot like vaccinations. The whole world is talking about drug development right now. Everyone at their dinner table is talking about Pfizer and Moderna. Everyone's got a comment on drug development and drug discovery. And everyone agrees they want quality and trust in what they're actually seeing. So the ticket price is high, but the ticket price has been historically high because of the dull, blunt instruments we've been using. There is consensus that if in fact you pick the right patients for the studies, you develop them in the specialty centers that have the track record of doing this with a medication that gives you the promise, that reduces the sample size, reduces the runway, and reduces the cost. So the innovation has created a new business model that in fact doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a long runway for all organizations. And in keeping with that, there can be efficiencies on cost.
Thanks, Roger. Now, I think we've heard a little bit about what this process is like from a company's perspective. Richard, I want to throw a question over to you. What's it like from your perspective, heading the CSE? You've been there for, you said, close to a decade now, and I feel like it's just over this past year that we've seen psychedelics company after company start to list on the exchange. So when do you feel like this started, and maybe this is too obvious of a question, but why do you think companies are gravitating towards going public rather than, raising money privately?
Well, there's a lot to unpack in that question, and thank you for that. It really was, I think, a couple of years ago that we began to see folks with the support of a number of small institutions that were instrumental in the support of the cannabis industry as it was beginning to come into the public markets, begin to organize themselves, do pre-public rounds, begin to develop the business plans and so on. And over the course of later last year, we began to see the first of these companies actually list on the exchanges. And this year, to date, companies in the psychedelic space have raised more than $330 million on the Canadian Securities Exchange. And that's obviously does not include money that's been raised by companies listed on other exchanges in Canada, the United States. So there's a clear investor appetite to support the research and the development of the businesses. And I guess there are a few cautionary tales actually tied in here, because there are some investors who think that this is cannabis 2.0, but these are completely different industries. Although cannabis certainly cries out for more research for medical applications of the various compounds. It's a consumer packaged good in Canada, the United States, for the most part, and other jurisdictions around the world. It's like beer or wine or some of the other consumer packaged goods industry. There's an opportunity to develop in an early time frame significant revenues for the successful entrepreneurs in this space. And as both Greg and Roger have highlighted, this is a completely different animal. We're talking about something which, again, if we think about early stage capital markets in Canada and the US, that's a lot more like mining exploration, or and there is a long history of companies that are doing research in the pharma space and life sciences space as well, that these are expensive and tend to be quite long dated businesses. So and again, extraordinarily expensive to execute the program. But there is a very well defined approach. We understand what the companies have to do from a disclosure perspective, right? The framework is there, right? So we're not pushing any envelopes here. You asked, part of the question is, well, why are the companies tapping the public markets and not the private markets as much as they would? I guess, there's two quick reasons for that. One, there is actually still a stigma attached to some of the psychedelic compounds. Some of the mainstream folks are, as they were in the cannabis space, a little reluctant to back clinical research involving some of these compounds, which are still some of them are still Schedule I drugs in the United States. The other component, of course, is there's an appetite in the public markets to support these companies. As I mentioned, we're not, we've got 2 quarters under our belts, and more than $330 million has been raised this year on the Canadian Securities Exchange alone. So there is support available for these companies from institutional and retail investors. Now, one final point, I think, in terms of the public capital markets story, is that to help, I guess, drive the attractiveness of these companies, people are looking for early commercialization opportunities for these compounds, and identifying jurisdictions around the world where it may be, where it is legal to, in fact, have a patient pipeline, clinics offer treatment protocols, and so on. And I guess, if I can be so blunt, to say, kind of kill 2 birds with 1 stone, that you're in a position to develop a revenue base, which then helps fund the clinical research, but you're also actually working with patients on particular issues and developing and advancing the knowledge with respect to specific compounds.
Angie, can I pick up on something Richard just said?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, this emphasis, Rich, I couldn't agree more on the early commercialization opportunities. I've had more than a dozen conversations with large pharma, and that's exactly what they're saying. Their priority today is to really work with organizations like ours, others work in the psychedelic space, that have near-term opportunities for them. And for now, what companies want, large companies want, and investors, of course, will be looking for this, is a short runway with a predictable line of sight, a known. Ketamine is already approved by the FDA and in many other jurisdictions, at least one of the versions is for depression. It's legal, it's safe, it's effective. And so you've seen in the last 6 months, large pharma beginning to acquire ketamine derivatives. At the same time, there is in fact a enthusiasm for what's happening with respect to some of the more sort of classical psychedelics. But there is that unknown part there. That being said, the unmet need in depression is extraordinary, and I think most know that. Most know that the status quo treatments have just simply not delivered. And it's not only the opportunity of giving someone a treatment that's innovative and works very rapidly, but there is in fact a suggestion as well that some of these treatments may be able to be taken more intermittently, that is, rather than being taken every day. So it's truly innovation. But I think in fact what I'm hearing from all the folks I speak to on the BD side from large pharma is we need near-term value here, and the near-term value will need to bridge us until we really read out some of the results from some of the more classic psychedelic studies We are absolutely hoping they're going to be successful, but that's going to take some time. And it's going to take a few years. And that's why I have always believed, again, this has been like everybody else. My views are refined by my experience. After 100,000 people we've seen in my program in the last 20 years, over 100 drugs being developed. I've seen many medications end up in a ditch rather than end up in a clinic helping patients because things have gone astray. So the investor community needs to, in this particular case, understand this is different than cannabis, and also within drug development psychiatry, this is a different ballgame than the Prozac era. And what we need to do is we need to walk and chew gum at the same time. What is the near-term opportunity? We need known knowns. We need commercial opportunity. We need to have a line of sight. That's the ketamine derivative. That's why at Braxia, we're pressing that point and looking at derivatives of ketamine, developing them in our centers, which have been the largest impact research centers in the world in depression. At the same time, we are also watching what's happening with the psychedelic space in terms of psilocybin, keeping a close eye on that, and then see where that goes on the regulatory side, obviously on the legal side, and we're going to obviously contribute to the scientific side. So I think that there are, in fact, near-term opportunities. The market's interested, large pharma's interested, keeping in mind who is the customer. For cannabis, the customer is the person walking down the main street, walks into a shop. That's not the customer here. The customer here is going to be large pharma. The customer here is going to be large pharma internationally. And they're going to be the ones ultimately who take it, and they're going to be asking questions about the quality of this data, who developed this product, and what patients were studied, and how was it developed. We can't have drugs developed in such a way that cannot be implemented. No one's going to pay for them. And pharma's going through these check boxes every day, watching this space closely.
You know, I feel like you guys have touched on a really significant point. To give a bit of context, I feel like when this field first started out, started to ramp up around a year and a half ago, we saw all these companies sort of navigating towards traditional psychedelic compounds. You know, there weren't a lot of NCEs around at that point. They were focused on psilocybin, MDMA. But over the last year, I've seen a lot of companies sort of expand into ketamine clinics, expand into developing a big portfolio, you know, trying to do some sort of thing that would help de-risk opportunities for investors in this space, right? So I think the next question I want to ask all of you, and we can start out with you, Greg, is, you know, a lot of companies have gone public. Both your companies are listed on the CSE. Obviously, a lot of these investors have to have patience, and it's going to take a while for these medications to come on market. How would you describe who your investor is? Who's your investor base? What sorts of backgrounds do they have? What sorts of things are they looking for in a company? Greg, I'll kick it off to you.
Right. Yeah. So our investor base, shifts over time. Right now, it's highly retail driven. You know, at the moment, most of our investors are up in Canada, although a lot of the operations of the company are down here in the United States. We've got, ultimately a strategy to get to deep-pocketed life science and biotech, investors who understand the drug development process, right? So given the fact that we're developing our compounds and our chemistries through a traditional ethical pharmaceutical drug development, pathway, we anticipate and already have frankly started the process of getting in front of investors who understand that process, who have invested in other life science drug development, stories in particular, who understand the timeframes, who understand the news flow elements, understand the value creation and the potential for these compounds and chemistries, who understand the partnering aspects of this industry where, we typically do work with large pharma to commercialize these technologies most often. So ultimately, I think we'll get there. At the moment, a lot of our investors are retail oriented. They are a lot in Canada. There's many investors we're talking to in other jurisdictions in Europe, Germany in particular, also in Australia a little bit. At this point, frankly, investors who are willing to take a little more risk, who did see what happened in the cannabis space, and do kind of view this as almost cannabis 2.0, although I think it's not that, as Richard had mentioned. It's something very, very different. But I think from an investment perspective, I think a lot of individuals who were successful there see this as another investment opportunity, which is sort of interesting to put these two pieces together. But I think ultimately, the people that will really provide significant capital for companies like Tryp will be, deep-pocketed life science, biotech, drug development-oriented investors at the end of the day.
Yeah, for us, Angie, the investors, it's a mixed group. We've got retail, also the institutional investors working with us. And I have to say, I've been really pleasantly surprised. Many people are looking under the hood. They're doing their homework, understanding the space. Angie, you really hit the nail on the head with how you prefaced your question around clinics. And I do think that's an important part of this insofar as we think about clinics in two ways. First of all, clinics are a way to provide ketamine currently in a high volume way, and people who need it in a way that's obviously efficient and profitable, et cetera. We have 4 clinics now in Canada, but our focus is really going to be expansive across America. Now, the clinics are not just the clinics insofar as an opportunity to give people treatment, which is critical. It's also an opportunity to evaluate some of our own NCEs, some of our own derivatives in our own clinics. In other words, my research infrastructure is actually populating some of these clinics where we're going to be testing out some of our products in some of the people who utilize our clinic services. And this is absolutely critical. It's absolutely critical wherein you have the ability to know which people should be coming into your clinical research studies. So when you have your own clinics, you not only are de-risking some of the R&D with respect to, getting across that finish line you want to get across, but there's something more nuanced to that, and that is if you have your own clinics, you have the ability to be more selective in the patients that you are, in fact, recruiting into your clinical research. And that is absolutely essential if, in fact, you want to increase the chance for success. So our model at Braxia is to do just as you sort of preface that, in the sense that we want to have brick and mortar. We want a place where people can receive the treatment in a way that's going to change their life positively. But also, it is a place where my research team, the human capital of that research team, can say this person, but not that person, should come into the clinical research because they are, in fact, more likely to benefit from this treatment. And that's exactly the model that we are building on. And the investors are coming to me and saying, that's what they're looking for. And that's the type of people that, in fact, I think are understanding how it really works underneath the hood.
It's kind of an interesting point, right? Yeji, if I could just add to that, of course, investors are an important component of how we all kind of work in the industry to move these drugs forward. Patient recruitment, as Roger's going to explain, and the clinics that they have to source patients is certainly very, very important. At Tryp, we're actually taking a slightly different approach to how we're accessing patients, and we're actually accessing knowledge. So we're going after a lot of non-depression, non-PTSD indications. Specifically, we're very focused on chronic pain and eating disorders at the moment. Again, there's high unmet medical need. There is a lot of rationale for why we believe that psychedelics will work in these patients who have failed almost every other treatment regimen, many of whom, especially in the chronic pain field, are addicted to opioids, which of course is a massive crisis here in the United States right now. But what we've done is we have tapped patients through our academic collaborators. So around the table, we've assembled now, we haven't announced all these yet. We've announced one of our partnerships with the University of Florida. We've got 3 others that we'll be announcing very shortly with very, very significant, well-heeled academic institutions with expertise in those disease indications that have access to patients that are highly appropriate, we think, for the studies that we'll be running. So that's been another critical resource that we brought to the table that has allowed us to tap into the right patient populations with very interesting disease states that don't really have a lot of great alternatives for therapeutic treatment at the moment.
Richard, what are your thoughts on this from the perspective of the CSE? You've seen the cannabis boom, now we're seeing the psychedelics boom. What are some of the differences and similarities between the investors who are getting involved?
Well, again, I think the many of the important private equity and institutional investors who supported the development of the industry, especially in the public markets, are the same folks as were behind Cannabis 1.0. And as Greg and Roger mentioned, they did well by and large as a result of those investments, and in fact are now looking to support different industries that may have in some respects similar profiles. And as I said, we're a long way away from where we were even 6 months to a year ago. But there's still some stigma attached that is going to keep some mainstream investors away from this space for a variety of reasons. But I think what people should understand when they're looking at the research that's being done is there's a lot of there. I mean, this isn't just some accidental, hey, this is the next big thing. Let's jump on the boat here. I mean, humans have been self-medicating with many of these compounds dating back 5,000 to 7,000 years. And for some of the other compounds which are not naturally occurring, but which were accidentally created in German labs in the early 20th century, there is a reasonably substantial body of 50 to 70-year-old clinical research, not to today's standards, of course, but that indicated that for a variety of mental health issues, whether it's addiction, depression, some of the other things that Greg and Roger have spoken about, that there is positive therapeutic benefit. But that comes with its own challenges because, of course, one of the issues with naturally occurring compounds are things that were conceived in German labs 100 and some odd years ago. The patent and intellectual property issues can be very challenging. And so we know that, of course, Big Pharma, with the expenses associated with bringing a drug to market, rely on the extensive patent protection period in order to obviously earn a return for their shareholders for the investments that they make in that clinical research and in bringing that drug to market. Those issues are not as clear-cut in this space, which is why you see a lot of work being done from a chemistry perspective on coming up with unique and patentable versions of some of these compounds, which have been in the public domain for many years now, to try to recreate or provide that element of intellectual property and patent protection in the event that, in fact, a drug does come to market. And I think one of the other things that investors do need to look at, and Roger, I believe, touched on this, is that this isn't a case, or many of these treatments are not 2 pills a day or 3 pills a day for the rest of your life. This is a situation where a course of treatment with a medical professional, whether it's a psychiatrist or other, doctor provided service. And if it's going to work, it will probably work in a, from Big Pharma's perspective, in a relatively short time frame. So the economics of the treatments that we're likely to see as a result of the work that Greg and Roger's companies are doing don't fit the classic profile that Big Pharma may be looking for to replace the Prozacs and some of the other compounds, which are now almost or at end of patent protection life at this time.
It's a really nice point, Richard, in terms of the there. We've had the first commercially available antidepressant since 1955. It was a drug that Ciba-Geigy, which was taken up by Novartis a few years back now, a drug called imipramine, and only 2 years ago. So the first antidepressant, 1955, only 2 years ago, did the FDA approve a so-called breakthrough in depression. That was ketamine. And so, Richard, you're absolutely right. This is a different ball game. The FDA's never been accused of superlatives, and you're using language like breakthrough to describe a treatment for depression. Obviously, is reflecting not just the science, but gives a tremendous, I think, positive valence to this area. The other part worth mentioning as well, and Richard, you have really hit the nail on the head in this one, is something I touched on, but I want to come back to it, and that's the implementation piece. Historically, again, I'll take a very narrow definition of history, beginning in 1955. History goes back a long way before that. But in the last, 6-7 decades, what's happened in the depression area, which is the world's #1 mental disorder in terms of prevalence, and certainly COVID's only added more tailwind to that, is we've taken pills every day. That's the chronic disease model. Take your pill every day. The new model is what we call episodic treatment. You take it in episodes. You don't take it every single day. You take it in episodes. Now, I would say after 100,000 patients in my career and over 3,500 treatments of ketamine later, I can say the following. Ketamine is a breakthrough. It works rapidly. People are much better. However, most, not 51%, over 80% will require some type of episodic treatment. And this will be no different than managing any other type of chronic disease. I often use the example like migraine. You can have a treatment that can decrease the frequency of the migraines. Of course, we want to completely resolve your migraine, but that's not really going to be reality for most people. And when you look at the best of science, as we understand neuroscience today, as we understand the pharmacology of psychedelics today, and as we look dispassionately at the available literature and our own experience, the reality is that most people will not be forever cured with any of these treatments. They will certainly, some will be a small percentage, but most will require episodic treatment. So we need to think about not just R&D. I always say it's not just R&D, it's RD&I, research, development, implementation. And how is this going to be provided? And so when we're talking about who's the customer, the customer is going to be pharma. Large pharma will want to see products they can trust, data the FDA believes in, but also, in fact, who's going to deliver this? Who's going to deliver this in a way that's scalable, that's reality-based? Who's going to pay for this? And those are the questions that we have to think about now, not later as an afterthought. And we're building that into how we are developing our ketamine derivatives and our psychedelics broadly at our center.
I feel like while Richard was talking, he brought up, he just opened up 5 different cans of worms, which we just cannot, Richard, you mentioned, how companies are trying to make their compounds patentable. You mentioned, how this is actually going to be implemented. I feel like you mentioned so many things that we just don't have time to get into right now. But with 3 minutes left, I think I just want to leave you guys with one question. And it's sort of the overarching question that's encompassed this whole panel. But, if you could leave the audience with one thought, what is needed for the industry to fulfill its financial potential? What's your personal answer to that question? What exactly needs to happen between now and the next 5 to 10 years when we actually see these medications come onto market? Greg, I'll start with you, and then we can have everyone sort of sign off with that.
Sure. Yeah. Definitely a lot of topics to cover on the next time that we get together, right? But I would say that what the industry needs to fulfill its financial obligations to investors really is data, right? I mean, everybody is pushing into the clinic, assertively. I actually think that because of the history of these chemistries, that we're going to get to those data points relatively, quickly. A number of companies, including ours, are already in phase 2A studies, or will be very shortly. At least one of the companies in the industry will have phase 2B data in a very significant study sometime in the fall, which I think will be a big watershed event for everybody. But I would say it all revolves around that, all about getting these chemistries into human subjects in significant enough numbers so that we can all see for ourselves that in well-controlled studies that these chemistries actually are safe, well-tolerated, and efficacious.
I would actually, for me, Angie, see 3 checkboxes to the commercial success. The first checkbox is near term. The second is quality. And the third, which is going to be really, really important, I think, here, is in fact to have data that can be implemented. So when I talk about near term, we have to in fact have data that is accumulating from products that have a near term opportunity. That for now is the ketamine derivatives. There's no doubt about that. And Big Pharma knows that. That's why they're acquiring. We've seen acquisitions by Merck and Novartis and Otsuka and many others in this space. Near term. The data have to be high quality, and high quality not subjectively defined, but objectively verifiable. In other words, it has to be developed in the appropriate clinics. And then thirdly, I think throughout this process, we need to have treatments that can be implemented very, very soon. That's the commercial opportunity. And I think those are the 3 themes that we need to have as our guiding principles for now. And again, going back to the comments I had earlier about the need to contemporaneously at the same time have the clinics, but also have the human capital to do that research in those centers. That's what Big Pharma is looking for in the near term.
And I think from an investor perspective, the most important word is patience. That's with a CE at the end, not a TS, because again, this is going to be a longer process, an expensive process. for these companies. Nothing would give me greater pleasure, or Greg or Roger, to have their companies turning over $3 billion in revenue by this time next year. But that's not what these companies are about at this stage. It's seeing the progression of the work, the necessary work that's being done to provide the underpinnings of what promise to be incredible treatments for extremely costly mental health issues that are endemic virtually around the world. And we know there's a need, and it's really gratifying to see that the market is supporting the efforts of people like Greg and Roger with their vast experience in the space. So I think we're going to get there. But again, patience is the key. It's going to take a little while.
You heard it, everyone. Patience. Okay, well, thank you guys all so much for your time. Again, this was Greg McKee, Roger McIntyre, and Richard Carleton. Thank you guys so much, and I hope you all enjoyed our panel.